And I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Hallie Schackinger. I'm one of the data analysts at CCA. And then I'm going to let our presenters, Dr. Christopher Ledford and Adam Blevins, introduce themselves, because for those that might be new, that didn't catch part one, Adam is joining us today. So that'll be nice. If you guys want to go ahead and start with that.
Yeah, I'll get us started. Good to see everybody again. Hope you all are doing well. For those who weren't here last time, my name is Chris Ledford. I'm the Associate Director in the Data Research and Advanced Analytics Unit at CPE. I've been there for about a year and a half and really just fortunate to work with a great team and a great longitudinal data system to investigate ways that we can help our aspiring young students do better, have better transitions, and ultimately get that college credential or degree that they're pursuing. Adam, over to you.
Absolutely. Well, as Hallie said, I was not presenting in the last one. I am no Travis Muncie, but I'll do my best. My name is Adam Blevins. I'm a senior associate here at the Council on Postsecondary Education. I work with Chris in our data and advanced analytics unit. I'm very excited to be with you all. I appreciate you having me on. And just a little thing, I've been in higher education for pretty much since I was a student in higher education, and I so appreciate getting to work with a team that does some high impact work like what we're going to be talking about today. It's very exciting to be able to do this and to share it with others. So just happy to be here and happy to be presenting for you all today.
So I'm going to go ahead and just give like a little recap of where we ended last time, just for those in case you're joining and you didn't get to make the first one, or maybe you haven't watched the first recording yet. So last time we started with basically why Kentucky's focusing on unmet financial need as an affordable metric and KPI for the institutions. And then we ended with the inferential and predictive model that are being implemented system-wide. So do you all mind just going through like another recap to set the stage today, and then we can kind of start digging more into the specifics from the research?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I think our story last time started with kind of the impetus for the work, which was a critical and core affordability metric for our public institutions that made sense and would ultimately function in a way that helped students. We kind of started with this research backdrop of all these affordability terms that we hear. Net price, tuition, you hear financial aid about grant aid and merit aid and so on. And all of these indicators are helpful, but more so suited for kind of aggregate institutional level description. When it comes to students, national research has kind of been trending towards this unmet financial need indicator, which essentially, if you recall, is kind of what's left after all of those things are taken into account, tuition or net price, whichever you prefer, and then after a student's exhausted all of their aid and their expected family contribution, that amount that's left that the student is accountable for is their unmet financial need. And that consideration, that dollar amount, that little dollar amount, is what a student's going to look at and evaluate their enrollment decision, their retention decision. Can I pay this? Do I need to drop out? Can I find another mean to pay for it if I don't have it? The ultimate question is, do I continue on? So it's a retention question. So with that in mind, our institutions, and like I said, institutions across the country are focusing on this individual level indicator of unmet financial need. The question really was, how do we set targets? How do we work with this indicator to design KPIs and targets as a state? And a lot of target setting kind of revolves around this idea of baselines. We were here in this baseline year, so we need to go down 1% or 5% or 10%. And that's a really effective way to set targets and in a process of continuous improvement. But our goal was to approach this question with empirics. How can we discern where a student becomes less likely to retain relative to their sector or to their institution as far as first-time students go? How can we predict that analytically and then provide that information back to the institution so they can set a goal with an inferential model, in our case, 10 years of data, set a goal, and then use predictive analytics to make informed, targeted decisions about who to help to bring that KPI above or to or above the goal, right? So we've got two kind of models, one inferential that helps set those goals. It's looking backwards, trends, how do we set the goal? And then how do we use predictive analytics to target students to get them and the institution as a whole beyond that goal? So again, inferential sets a target, and then that machine learning model helps us get past the target. So today, I think it would be good to go through some of the stuff that we found out in our inferential modeling and how that what that means in the operation in the background of the predictive analytics and what that might mean practically for institutions.
Thank you. And then I know last time we talked about how the model is using longitudinal data, and we're using it over a little like decade of data. So can we just talk about knowing that it's over a decade of data, and then maybe start talking about the major takeaways from the inferential model in just like a little bit more detail, and then also maybe some of the implications for both students and institutions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So in terms of the models themselves, that 10 years of data gives us a very wide time frame from which we can work and kind of see some of those trends and utilize some of those student level controls to have a better understanding of, what actually is going into this retention rate, for example, what's going into these student success factors. And I will say, Chris, feel free to jump in whenever you'd like. But I think in terms of the big takeaways that we have coming out of that, there are two that immediately kind of jump out from the page to me. Firstly, unmet financial need is really a major predictor of student success across all the subgroups that we included in this inferential model. And secondly, the unmet financial need really, it may exacerbate disparities across demographic subgroups. So there's a consideration for that equity piece as well that I'll get into here in just a moment. I actually have some slides for both of these. If you all don't mind, I'll go ahead and share those. Might help to have some visuals with what I'm saying. Perfect. Can anyone see that, Chris? Thumbs up if you can. Perfect. Love it. So, we talked about the retention piece some in the first section, but for those who weren't here, and also just as a general refresher, I'll run through some of this again. But tying this back into one of those major takeaways of financial or unmet financial need being a major predictor of student success, here defined as that retention rate. We can see here in our first little chart, unmet financial need really has a substantive impact across all subgroups that we've included here and across sector type in terms of the institution, in terms of the likelihood that a student would be retained. So, we look at these two all columns, that's for our overall student body. So for our 4-year regional institutions, our public regional institutions with no unmet financial needs, so that first row there, there's an 87% likelihood that students will be retained. They have no unmet financial need. At our 2-year publics, it's a little bit lower at 74%. But you can see here across all the overall student body versus URN versus low income, it's really consistent across the board. Like you don't see some of those disparities you typically associate when looking at subgroups like this when they're disaggregated. Even for low income students, that retention rate is substantially higher whenever there's no unmet financial need present. But whenever you start looking at unmet financial need, and whenever that is added kind of into this equation, we see some pretty disparate drop-offs, even just at that $5,000 level of unmet financial need there. So, for example, for our four-year institutions, we see a 5% drop off here compared to about an 8% for our URM students and a 7% for our low income students as well. So there is a considerable gap whenever you continue going down this unmet financial need, these unmet financial need brackets. And that really sticks across sector. And if you look at our two-year publics, it's even more exacerbated here. As you can see, about an 11 percentage point decrease for the overall student body with that $5,000 unmet financial need level being added. And that really, and then you look over at the URN, our low income student subgroups here, and you see decreases of about 14 percentage points and 17 percentage points respectively. So we can see that this really has a pretty major impact on our students' likelihood of being retained. And here's kind of a different way of looking at it with a bit of a time trend as well. As you can see, over time, this goes back to 2011-12, all the way up to 2020-21, which is the most current data we had to include in here, just given the fact that we're looking at retention as our success metric. And what you see is it's pretty consistent over time that unmet financial need, as that increases, the likelihood of retention decreases. Now here we're looking for our four-year public research institutions. So for Kentucky, that would include the University of Kentucky, University of Louisville. And you see some flattening over time here. And we gave a shout out, I'll do it again here. A lot of this is driven by the great work going on at the University of Kentucky with their LEADS program, which essentially operationalizes a very similar kind of predictive model to find some of those tipping points and provide some of that provide some of that financial assistance to those with unmet financial need. And so, typically you would, if you were strategically applying this, you're making those decisions about that aid allocation. We'll get more into this later. You would typically see it kind of happening on that left-hand side of these lines, where you can really make an impact with bring some of those students with lower levels of unmet financial need down to zero as close to as possible. And we'll kind of get into that. I'll kind of get into that here in just a minute, talking about the equity piece. But this trend really holds constant across our sectors. So here we're looking again at our public regionals or comprehensive four-year institutions. Again, really consistent decreases in the likelihood of being retained as you increase the level of unmet financial need, which again is more substantial in terms of that gap between that $0 unmet financial need versus that 15, 20K line on the right-hand side of each of these subgroups here, or these boxes here for each academic year. And so to talk a little bit more about the equity piece, this is kind of the other big picture finding. When we look at this and here we're essentially disaggregating our URM group into respective race and ethnicities here, and group by four-year public research, four-year comprehensive, and two-year public institutions. And what we see again is these boxes represent the median amount of unmet financial need for each of these racial and ethnic sectors here. So again, see some of those disparities cropping up here. If you were to look at, let's just look at this middle box, for example, this middle group for our comprehensives. For white students, that's around rounding up to $4,900 is the median. You look at two or more races, that's almost $9,000 in terms of the median. So there are some pretty substantial disparities in terms of the level of unmet need that students across different subgroups actually have. And kind of pivoting to that low income side of things, we break this out and look at income quartiles. So think of that fourth quartile as the highest end of household income for these students. You see across the board, across sector, $0 is the unmet financial need, which is really substantial. I mean, it also makes sense in the context that we have here, because you'd expect that higher income households can probably afford to cover that cost of attendance for students. They may be in a better position for some of those scholarships or merit-based aid opportunities, just given that wealth disparity as well. But then as you kind of move to the left there and go down the quartiles, you see some pretty substantial jumps in terms of that median amount of unmet financial need. That second quartile toward the top of it would be essentially where you'd expect to find the median for this entire population. And you see it goes from the top quartile at 0 as the median up to, for our public research institutions, 10,500. For our comprehensive, about 9,400, and for our 2-year publics, about $5,600. And then our lowest quartile that even increases still. So again, you see some of these gaps. And to tie this all kind of together, here's another chart where I was talking about, it may be logical to apply some of that institutional financial assistance kind of to that lower end to bring students down to $0 of unmet financial need or close to it. The concern with an equity perspective would be we see a lot of the concentration of those upper unmet financial need categories being comprised of URM students. We're making up a larger percentage of the URM student population, I should say. As you can see, let's just look at the full-year public research institutions. For URM students, about 28% of them have no unmet financial need. For non-URM students, it's about 40% of them have no unmet financial need. And that story kind of flips if you look down at the far end there at $15,000 or more in unmet financial need. Across sector, it's going to be a higher proportion for URM students compared to non-URM students. So the big picture here to kind of tie this piece up, unmet financial need really results in a disproportionate impact, especially for our underrepresented students. Due to the prevalence of them being in higher brackets, it thereby really means that they're predisposed by this unmet financial need to lower likelihood of being retained. And if folks in these kind of higher brackets are there, there's an inequity concern in terms of where those financial funds are being allocated and how it may further exacerbate and further provide some disparate outcomes there. I'll leave it there. I've been talking for a minute. I'll let us move on.
So can you all go through some of the trends that you're seeing in unmet need over time? And then what does this look like for different populations of students?
I'd be happy to do that as well. I have some more slides, so let me get those ready too.
And while he's getting that ready, I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions at any point, just put them in the chat and I'll monitor the chat, and we can kind of, if we don't mind interrupting a little bit, and then we can answer those if anything jumps out at us.
Absolutely. All right, can everyone see that? Beautiful. All right, so when we talk about trends, I kind of went over some of this from a student outcome perspective, but now we can pivot more toward that institutional perspective. And the big picture here is we see relationships really between increasing grant aid and decreasing levels of financial aid at our institutions. But again, because a lot of the students in that lower category may be getting down to 0 or lower levels of unmet financial need, they're the ones that may be helped the most for some of this institutional aid that's being provided. We can get into the specifics here a little bit with these charts. But first, we're going to look at our 4-year public research institutions. And in Kentucky, as it is across the nation, the median cost of attendance represented by this big yellow line here is increasing over time. This blue line represents the median unmet need. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing that for all students. On the right-hand side, you're seeing it for only students with unmet financial need. And you can see that across time for all students, that figure is going down. That makes sense if a lot of folks are being pulled down to 0 or lower amounts of unmet financial need. But even with those who have unmet financial need, we see a pretty flat line here relative to that increase in the median cost of attendance. And what explains a lot of this, at least from this descriptive perspective, is if you look at this red line for institutional aid, it's really sharply going up over time, which coincides again with that median level of unmet financial need for students. So you can really see how institutions may be looking to respond to some of this unmet financial need and kind of that bigger picture perspective. It's the same story when we flip over to our full-year public institutions, our full-year comprehensive regional institutions. Cost of attendance going up. Here you see some more pronounced declines in terms of that median unmet financial need and sharper increases in that median institutional aid in the red there. Going from 0 back here in 2011-12 all the way up to $4,000 is the median. Pretty substantial increase and pretty substantial increase in the median on that financial need for students. Where this doesn't necessarily track the same is with our 2-year public institutions, and it's largely, they serve higher proportions of under-resourced, underrepresented students generally, and they also have other resource limitations that larger institutions may not have, at least to the same scale. And so what we see here is, whereas others may have increasing levels of institutional aid, we see increasing levels of median state aid here on this green line in both of these charts. We still see, of all 3 of these subgroups in terms of, all 3 of these sectors, we see the sharpest declines in that unmet financial need, but we also see some pretty considerable declines here in terms of median cost of attendance, and for all students here at students with unmet financial need here on the right, a really flat rate of decrease across the board. So whereas some institutions are really utilizing this, utilizing institutional aid to respond to unmet financial needs of students that way, these institutions seem to be using things like tuition rate control and things like that to help support students, and as well as some of that state aid. So there's kind of a quick overview of more of that institutional side for terms of.
And so if you all don't mind going into a little bit more about how this unmet financial need impacts student success, and then what does the model suggest around that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. If you recall from the slides that Adam walked through so well, it really depends on the sector level. Across the board, we see, a little north of a percentage point decline in retention likelihood to a second year for the whole public system in Kentucky. But if you kind of focus in on our regional comprehensive, so 4-year universities that do not have R1 status, but are more nestled in regional areas of the state and serving those populations, that rate of decline that's attributed to unmet financial need jumps up to almost 2 percentage points per $1,000. And then if you recall the 2-year slides that you saw, it's got those big sweeping declining lines, about a 2.5 percentage point decline in retention likelihood for each $1,000 in unmet need. And you may be thinking, well, percentage point, 2 percentage points, 2.5, that doesn't sound like a lot. But if you go back to the other slides that Adam walked through so well in those descriptives with the median levels, the median student, at a 2-year public institution is, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. If I'm recalling, at our 4-year comprehensive institutions, we're talking $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. The multiplicative factor, you're talking about students who are at the median of unmet financial need are already, just because of their financial circumstances and controlling for other factors, 15 to 20% less likely to return than the student with no unmet financial need. So at the 50th percentile, we're talking about a 20%, 15 to 20% decline in retention likelihood. And of course, we've got 50% of the sample over time beyond that. So you can clearly see that unmet financial need has a significant impact on student success and retention likelihood. The other thing that I would kind of, two things that I would point out going back to Adam's discussion. Adam focused on the disparities of amount on average or at the median of unmet need across groups. But that same logic applies when we're talking about impact or, retention likelihood as a function of those things. Those students who are in low income buckets, who are in underrepresented racial and ethnic background, those buckets, the implications of those higher amounts of need also have more serious implications for their retention likelihood. So again, there's an equity component to this piece. Something we're going to get into a little bit more, I think, later, but I'll kind of tease here. Adam, you did a really good job for the 4 years. We kind of see an inverted relationship despite rising costs of attendance and economic factors beyond the institution. You see that institutional aid has an inverted relationship to unmet financial need. And just simply that reflects across the board all the creative strategies that our institutions are using to suppress affordability barriers for students, despite economic conditions and the rising cost of attendance. So if you think about, well, what is institutional aid? We keep talking about institutional aid. What is that? And again, it's inversely related or inverted to unmet financial need. Well, if you think about your institutions, or if you're at a SHIO organization or a partner organization, some institutions that might be in your network, institutional aid usually involves small amounts of awards given to many students. That might be something like a laptop loaner program, or it might be an actual infusion of grant aid in the financial aid file. But usually across the board, we're talking about a $1,000, maybe $1,500, $2,000 assistance to a student, to multiple students. That's really effective, and you saw it in Adam's data there. That's really effective at bringing people who are close to zero or just slightly above zero in terms of unmet need to zero. And as Adam showed, the percentage of our student population who's in that zero bucket has grown tremendously over time. Almost 35% of our students have zero unmet financial need. But if you think about at the other end of the spectrum, that $1,000, $1,500 or $1,500, $2,000 award's not going to help somebody that has an extremely high amount of need, right? And so although you see proportionally the zero bucket getting much larger, which is a good thing over time, you also see the bucket at the far end of the spectrum, which Adam, I believe in your chart was 15,000 or more. And even the one before that, 12,500 before, you see those getting bigger too. And that's where you see this efficacy versus equity trade-off. The small awards are going to help pull many students who are close to zero or slightly above zero to zero. But what about folks at the other end of the spectrum who we know are tremendously more likely to be low income and from an underrepresented minority background? So those are the kind of things, to think about here, but also from a practical application. Those are things that we're thinking about as we're talking to our institutions about this and deploying, this predictive model.
So now that we've kind of looked at how it impacts student success, and then we've looked at some of the key findings of the research, how can institutions use this information to go with and implement it and support student success?
Sure. I actually have a slide that I'll share that I think might be useful here. Adam, can you see that? Okay. Let's see. All right. This is, I skipped over this one. This is one that I could have shown a second ago. Again, looking at the difference over time in the distribution of students by.
Hold on, Chris. I'm not seeing your screen.
Yeah, it's not coming up.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay. This one speaks to what I was just talking about a second ago. This is looking at the distribution of our public students by unmet financial need amounts in their first academic year. This is 2011 and again 2020, where we ended allowing for time for a second year of retention beyond this. But you can see over time that there's a tremendously larger proportion of students with zero unmet financial need. However, down here at the highest levels of unmet financial need brackets, and this has gone up almost 8 percentage points or almost 7 percentage points. You see institutional and state grant aid pulling folks from these buckets down to zero. But again, the general idea is that they don't help students down here in these buckets very much. We've got an efficiency versus efficacy, or an efficacy versus equity conversation. It's good. Don't get me wrong. It's great to bring students to zero or close to zero. But we also have students down here who might be performing well academically, but facing a very high barrier due to their unmet financial need. Now back to your most recent question. Have a lap on me. This is my great attempt at making some compelling charts in PowerPoint. But let's just say, for example, what was the silly example from last week? Ledford's College of Excellence. Let's say that over time, this institution has set a retention goal of 80%. And that's their KPI. They've worked with, their state agency to set this goal, and that's what they're going to be evaluated on going forward. From our models, you can kind of think about the efficacy and the equity trade-off in these terms. So, an institution, we've used this inferential model to set a target of 80%. And now the institutions can submit their data on their first-time students, as we showed last time. They get an output back that shows a retention likelihood. And of course, they know the unmet financial need amount. For some institutions, it might be most practical to look at students, who are kind of around the median, a little bit lower unmet financial needs, certainly not, down here at the bottom at $20,000, but who are close to this retention line, and they have a moderate amount of unmet financial needs. So the institution can look at, the output from the predictive model and say, okay, who's got a decent retention likelihood, a high retention likelihood that we, if we bring their unmet need down, so, up this chart, they go above this line, we need to focus our efforts here. This is efficacy. It's efficiency, if that makes sense. But again, if you think back to the other point that I made, and again, that bucket down at the bottom of folks that's also getting bigger, some institutions, may wonder, well, we've got folks down here who are performing well academically, but they face a sizable financial barrier. If I bring students who are kind of in this area, I just put these circles on the recent 2 years instead of making this chart look crazy. But if I focus on some institutions here or some students here in equitable outcomes, again, folks who are more likely to be URM or low income, how can I bring these folks closer to this target? How can I bring these folks closer to or above this target? Either strategy, from an empirical perspective, based on this predictive model, should overall increase the institution's retention rate to a second year. But back to your question, the strategy depends on the institution. And if we're looking at R1s and R2s versus some of our regional comprehensive and kind of satellite universities, those schools are going to have more money to be able to focus perhaps on both of these. The resource game and the amount of money and aid that an institution can infuse into students is going to be vastly different for a regional comprehensive or a 2-year community college, right? And I think to kind of wrap up that thought, that's the great thing about what I feel like we're doing with this predictive model. We're not, as the state's kind of coordinating agency for post-secondary education, we're not encouraging institutions to do one or the other. The institutions know their financial circumstances, their student services, where their budget is distributed better than we do. And they work with these students every day. But what we can do is provide the predictive model so that they can run student records against it in real time and get predictions back minutes later, and then start making the decisions about, do we focus on getting as many students as possible above that line? Do we focus, a little bit on efficiency and equity, or do we take an equity focus for perspective and look, for results over the long run? Kind of the unintended consequence of what we've been able to do. And we're just getting started with this. What's going to be profound going forward, the student success implications are huge. The target and goal setting implications are huge. But back to this financial budgeting consideration, our institutions are telling us how much money this is going to save them over time, because most of our institutions send work like this, at the clip of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, to third-party analytics groups. Back to part one, because of our state longitudinal data system, and I'll add to that our partners, the Kentucky Center for Statistics, who, along with the Kentucky Department of Education, have all of our secondary data. We can do all of this in-house because of the collection and the collaboration with our institutions, create something like this, a model like this, and give it right back to the folks who are going to use it on the front lines.
And you bring up a good point about each institution using it how they need it best. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about maybe what some of the policy implications are for those institutions who want to incorporate a model. Maybe what you might see as like the different challenges that different institutions might face in that. And then I have a follow-up question to that. So I don't know if you want me to ask the follow-up question or just start with that first one.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about the policy implications and then some of the major benefits and drawbacks associated with the implementation of machine learning at post-secondary institutions in general.
Sure. On the first one, the other thought that I would kind of add, we were kind of hitting around your question there at the end of the last thing. I said the one thing I think I would add is this model, and of course the ability to take our institution's data and provide something back to them that's empirical rather than taking this sort of baseline approach. The potential for student success is huge. And, kind of secondary to that is budget and financial costs that we could potentially save for our institutions that would go right back into student supports, I would assume. But again, I think the takeaway for me is that, every institution has different resources, and they can approach these data, for each institution gets a report back that's kind of tailored to their institution, and they can focus on those data however they see fit, based on the institutional and budget constraints that they have. There is no right or wrong way. Again, like I said earlier, I think as long as they have this empirical foundation to attack this question, the outcomes will be good. It's just a matter of how can you take your resources and juxtapose those with this efficacy and equity question and find what works best for your institution and your student population. Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it incredibly well. Talking about those drawbacks and benefits, I think, again, the big pic, I don't mean to echo, but again, the big picture is, that efficacy or equity question, right? Institutions should absolutely find the balance that works for them, that works for their students, that works for their operations and everything like that. But as we continue to work, as we continue to look at our KPIs and how we strategically approach these concerns, keeping in mind some of those disparities, keeping in mind, especially those folks kind of at that upper bracket, I think is also pretty imperative, especially when we talk about more refined KPIs that maybe look at disaggregated subgroups or, low income students and underrepresented students and things like that. I think it's still very key. But again, it's just really about finding that balance. I know that's a lot of echoing what Chris has already said, but to me, that's kind of the big picture about implementing this is, yes, it is incredibly helpful and that provides you a real time and proactive way of supporting your students, but being mindful of the students that you are supporting versus those who maybe you are unable to support due to financial or resource constraints. That to me is kind of the big picture.
Yeah, one thing I would add to, Adam, you and I were talking about this earlier last week or sometime. The institutions, to be clear, don't have to target students and bring them to zero, but it's an empirical approach to how can we, look at the retention average for the cohort, for the sector, for our institution, and target students and bring them to that level or to a level where their retention likelihood becomes higher than that, or more likely than the cohort average or the sector average. And so your question, that's one thing I meant to say earlier, but to kind of tie this all together, what we're really talking about, especially in Kentucky, and I'm sure in all of your states, is getting quality degrees and credentials in the hands of students. And if you think back to our day one discussion last time, we know that once students make it to a second year of college, that their retention rate is in the 90s, especially at our four-year institutions. And the further you go on, second to third, third to fourth, fourth to fifth if necessary, and so on, the likelihood of retention is well into the 90s. Any retention model that looks at second, third, fourth, fifth year students is going to be really, really, really accurate. In other words, the business end of this, the implications and the policy implications of this are first year students. That's where we lose post-secondary enrollment. Once we have folks who've matriculated, we are most likely to lose them in the first year. So that's kind of where this focus is. Putting all this together, how can we help students succeed to a second year? How can we, resonate this information with what we know about our targets and our goals, and then make targeted decisions based on the output and ultimately drive that retention rate. The more folks we get to a second year, the more folks will complete and earn their credential. And so your second part was about some potential drawbacks, is that right?
Drawbacks, and then also just introducing machine learning at post-secondary institutions.
Adam, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've kind of talked around this quite a bit as we've worked through a lot of this material, but the drawbacks, of course, you think of um, for some institutions, especially who may be smaller or have more limited resources, the typical constraint would be, do you have the personnel? Do you have the ability to do things like this with predictive modeling? Are you able to actually do that? And that's kind of the beauty of us being able to provide this for our institutions is, we're hoping that this helps shore up some of that resource disparity there across institutions so that this could be more widely applied. The other piece, in terms of more tangible drawbacks, I touched on that. Chris has been through this as well, but kind of that equity and efficacy component, that creates kind of a balance that is not quite so easy to deal with, right, or quite so easy to manage. The benefits, though, are huge. Chris just went over some of those in terms of, the big picture of getting degrees, getting credentials in folks' hand. And that's fantastic, not only for, institutions meeting their KPIs and things like that, but that's really impactful for students. That's really impactful for folks seeking that economic mobility that post-secondary education promotes and promises, right? And so, the upstream of this is also, this is really important for retention, and success is really important for economic viability into the future, getting folks through some of those more high demand fields and things like that, and ensuring their success. So in a way, this is also a huge piece of bolstering that economic component post graduation if you start looking way down the future as well. So that's kind of the small scale, big scale kind of benefits and drawbacks there that I have kind of off the bat. If there's any other pieces to contribute, Chris, I welcome you. But that to me is, again, kind of that big picture, small pictures.
Yeah, I'll add one thing, kind of diverges from some of the stuff that we've been talking about a bit. And I'll keep it short because I do want to have some time for the audience if they want to ask questions. But there's always going to be some element of the business who are resistant to this, and in this case, helping underserved or underrepresented students based on those circumstances, like affordability, this merit versus non-merit argument. And let me just say that approaching this problem from this way and thinking about the equity component of this can only serve to benefit the entire campus community, most notably helping students who are doing well, performing well academically, et cetera, who are otherwise ready to retain to a second year but facing a barrier. The implications for them are first and foremost. But those students, the more students that we can help get to the next level, it betters the institutional community. It puts more revenue and fills more classes and creates more dialogues in those classes and a better culture for the overall institution. Kind of what Adam was talking about, everybody then can go forth, earn a credential, attain, and go into the state workforce and create a strong tax base and a diverse work pool, and so on and so on and so on. Again, that's a really condensed explanation of kind of the benefits of this, long-term benefits of this, but just to say that some folks will be resistant to efforts like this in your states or in your institutions, but the benefits, short-term and long-term, are equally profound.
Thank you for that. Chris, if you don't mind, I do have a question that we didn't get to last time. I didn't know if you would mind if I asked that now. You're okay with that? I kind of wanted to circle back to what Adam was talking about and how some institutions maybe might have the resources or the personnel to implement something like this. So I kind of want to, before we get to maybe some audience questions, kind of go into kind of some action steps that maybe institutions could take. So I might have kind of a two-part question for you. What do you see as CPE's role in spreading the information around the model? Is there some kind of how-to manual or guidance that you all are planning on? And if not, then maybe what are some first steps that institutions could take to make this work possible for implementation?
I think what makes this work very well and will continue to make it work well as we deploy this in our state is our institutional data come through institutional research offices at all of our post-secondary institutions, and they come to us. And those are the folks at the state coordinating agency that we liaise with about the student data. When IR representatives or campus representatives run, a first-time student list in the middle of a semester against our model, and they get it back, that's happening in the same space where the data come to us. They can upload a custom file, it comes to us, and it goes right back. Through that infrastructure, that person at each campus, the IR lead, the institutional research lead at each campus, is the gatekeeper of that information. And then that person who is trained, who is versed in these topics and what these numbers and statistics mean, can take that and disseminate it to provosts, to CBOs, to financial aid, to student success. Again, Adam, I think you hit this. It's not like we're talking about a new and novel population of folks. We're just talking about one aspect of their academic circumstances, right? Their finances. But, that information can be shared with a TRIO office or a diversity office or a belonging office, or, the list goes on and on and on and on. And that person, by disseminating that information at their campus, can get the right folks on board who need to work with the students that the institution has identified. I think all of those steps are key in what makes this work. An upload process that's secure, that's instant, that the folks at the institutions are familiar with, if you have those in your states, that mechanism being the same process through which they get data back. And then having an IR gatekeeper at the institution to interpret, to start small. We work with a group of IR specialists in our data unit at all of our campuses, and then they disseminate that information back where they are. We can outline a kind of a how-to. I'm certainly glad to do that, because I think, again, this work is really important, and that's why we want to share it. I think the opportunity for success, and again, the University of Kentucky has been doing something like this for 7 or 8 years. And this is an institution whose second year retention rates were already in the upper 80s, and they're now in the mid to upper 90s. Usually you see retention rates plateau. They can't go any higher than 85 or 90%. And what they're doing with empirics and analytics, just like these at the University of Kentucky, is paying major dividends. They're returning more folks to the second year than ever before, every year that passes on the calendar. It works. Empirics work. But writ large, I think gatekeepers and having a close group of folks that can interpret, make decisions, and then take that and disseminate it back at their institutions is key.
Thank you. I think we have about 5 minutes left, so maybe 4 minutes. So I'm going to just leave it up to any audience questions. And if we don't have any audience questions, then we can wrap up. But I'm going to give it a couple minutes to see if anyone puts anything in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So if you guys, do you have anything else, any closing remarks or anything else to say?
Yeah, I'll add, I think
If not, we'll
I have one thought. We have kind of talked about this in conference presentations and whatnot before, and certainly met folks working in higher ed across the country, and then kind of touch base with them offline about how to get this work started, or how to use predictive modeling in their work more generally. At its core, we're focused on affordability a lot in this discussion, but really what we're talking about is a retention model. But anyway, we've been able to network and work with folks offline to answer questions about getting started, or even technical ones like, how do you make it such that an institution can upload this file and get predicted probabilities back? Anything that folks might be thinking of, we'll drop some emails here in the chat, and be happy to answer any questions offline that folks may have.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea, because I think it's a very complex setup, and it might not be something where you can just answer the questions just now. So that would be great if you could drop your emails in there.
In the past, we have actually, folks have been able to go back to their kind of SHIO organization, their state level organization, or an institution, and kind of get a team together, and then we kind of do an outreach or a work group that way, and that's an option too, maybe to get some IT folks and some research folks who are in the weeds with SQL and R and all this alphabet soup. Happy to do that as well. We're here to help folks in any way we can.
Well, I want to thank you both, to our presenters, and then everyone else for joining us. This has been recorded, so I'm going to send this out after it downloads and does all that. So look for that in your inboxes. And I really appreciate all of you joining us today, and have a good day.
Thank you all.